Hello, my name is Paolo Debuque. I am the Chancel Choir Director and Music Coordinator here at Good Samaritan. My pronouns are he and him, and I am joined today by my good friend, Mr. Jeremy Wong. Jeremy is a singer and conductor based here in the Twin Cities. He currently sings in cantus and has brought to our music ministry this week music from his background as a third-generation Okinawan Chinese man born and raised in Hawaii. A lot of interesting stuff, and I'm excited to talk about it with you, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. As you said before, I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I grew up with a family of musicians. My mom is a flutist, and my dad is a timpanist. And so that kind of, I guess, set me off on my path when I was growing up. I went through like 5 different career paths that I wanted to go down, and then all of a sudden in my junior year of high school, my choir director sat me down and was like, hey, would you like to conduct a piece for our spring fundraiser? And that was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, music, I want to study music for a living. So after that, I went to AAPI University in Greencastle, Indiana, this tiny little, town in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. Got my bachelor's there, and then moved back home to get my master's degree. And then I'd been teaching in Hawaii, teaching and conducting and singing in Hawaii from then until last year when I joined cantus.
So it sounds like growing up you had pretty deep connections to Western classical music through timpani, flute. Your degrees, I assume, are in the Western tradition.
Yeah.
But how did that interact or not interact with the Asian American elements of your heritage?
It's really funny because it's complicated in that because Hawaii is such a diverse population in general, we have these kind of, we have not camps, but we have communities where it's like I didn't refer to myself as Asian American until I went to school at DePaul. When we were growing up, it's like, oh, I'm Chinese. I'm Chinese Japanese. Oh, I'm Hawaiian. I'm Filipino.
Right.
We refer to ourselves as the ethnicity,
right,
and not as I am an Asian American who has this heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and for me growing up, and particularly for my parents, they kind of grew up in a generation or at a point in time in Hawaii where I think there was a lot of not necessarily repression of ethnic cultures, but certainly at that point, people tried to, diminish the Hawaiian language, and a lot of other languages. It was like, okay, proper English is the way to go. And so, my parents and a lot of people of that generation and the generation before that, particularly when they were, affected by the wars. I think that's where a lot of people went, that's the direction that a lot of people went to when they were in Hawaii. And so, excuse me. And so growing up, it was, I considered myself pretty westernized, I guess. And so, we have festivals every year. We have the Okinawan festival, and my mom's side of the family is Okinawan, and my dad's side is Chinese. And every year, we would go to the Okinawan festival and see my grandfather play the shamisen, which is an Okinawan or Japanese kind of string plucked instrument. And then every year we would go to my Chinese side of the family's, my Chinese grandfather's grave, and do a Chinese funeral ceremony or a burial ceremony. So these were all things that were kind of baked into my experience, but it was not necessarily this is something you do because you're Asian.
Yeah.
So it's not something that I really had to think about until I moved to the States.
And I guess 2 questions. At what point or was there a meaningful moment that you realized you were cast as an Asian American? How did your self-identification and then this kind of tacked on identification of Asian American, when did those rub together or interchange?
Yeah, it was my senior year of undergrad, and it was during it was an English class. I had to get a writing credit, and I took a class on Shakespeare, and so I ended up doing one of my papers. We were reading The Tempest, and so I ended up writing one of my papers on the character Caliban, who in The Tempest, this is a while ago, so my memory of this is kind of foggy, or at least the plot line. But Caliban, it features adventurers or people who go to this undiscovered island, and they discover that it has some magical sprites and creatures that are outside of the human nature.
Yeah, sure.
And so one of these characters is named Caliban, and he is kind of this kind of brusque and seemingly dumb, kind of almost comic relief character, and yet it's very interesting because Shakespeare writes him in such a way where to the outsiders, he speaks very brusquely and he speaks very, plainly. But in his own monologue, and when Shakespeare writes his monologue when he's interacting with some of the natives of the island, it's actually quite beautiful. It's quite florid, and it shows this other side. So all that to say, I wrote this paper in this Shakespeare class comparing Caliban to the Asian American experience. And I had gone down this rabbit hole of, people talk about the glass ceiling for women, right? And so I found this article that talked about the bamboo ceiling for Asian Americans, where it's like, there are so many, Asian Americans are quote unquote the model minority. Right. They work hard, they put their heads down, they do the work no matter what is asked of them. That's the stereotype. And so it's like there are so many Asian Americans in middle management and middle upper management, but how many CEOs in the States are Asian American? Hardly any. And so that article was kind of talking about why that might have been, and that was the kind of the first moment where I started really thinking about my place in I guess greater U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's reminded me of something that I've thought about a little bit, which is a kind of realization for me that this mold of Asian American that I've, conceptualized from an early age and kind of not been able to figure out how I am that. For me, that identity, Asian American, breaks down when you really interrogate it in many ways. I mean, why I am the child of highly educated, affluent Filipino Chinese people who came here for graduate degrees. And but in the census, I'm grouped with refugees of war.
Right.
And you realize that the Asian American label is externally, it's a white person's label. We all have slanty eyes, so we all have yellow skin, and so therefore we check the same box. And I'm wondering about your take on something is lost and something is gained, I think, by the clumping, in that there is a loss to me of self-identification, but there is a kind of just raw numbers in terms of we're a bigger voting bloc if we're all Asian Americans rather than Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, all these things. So how does that strike you? What in your transition from feeling Okinawan Chinese to identifying with this larger label?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I've thought about it in exactly those terms. Yeah, that's a big question too, right? It's like, what difference? What is the difference in, like, you know, grouping all of these people together so that they have more collective power?
Right.
And how can we group all of them together to you know, have a bigger voice, I guess, in the say of U.S. politics or just the U.S. in general, and highlight, you know, the stories that make it so,
Right.
make each individual family, each individual history so unique. I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
Yeah. Classic interview mistake. Asking you something that I've thought about.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's a good thing to think about, and that's something that I will definitely continue to think about for sure.
I guess the question that started it is like, what are the differences or similarities between Jeremy as Okinawan, Chinese, Hawaiian things happening, and Jeremy, Asian American? How does it affect? You said that there was, you know, that there was a realization point of this different, larger label.
Yeah, I think in some way or another, I've kind of always seen myself as a little bit of, like, from the outside looking in. When I was in Hawaii, it was like, you know, I am Okinawan, I'm not Japanese, and there's a whole, you know, fraught history there between Okinawa and Japan. And just on the sheer fact that, like, you know, Okinawan people tend to look differently than traditional East Asian, you know, presenting people. You know, the stereotype is you know, they have a little bit more body hair, they have a little bit stockier build, and they have, you know, this and this and this. And I very much fell into that camp as I was growing up. And so it was, I felt a little bit of a disconnect there, at least with, you know, my friends who are Chinese or Japanese or Korean or what have you. And then I think, you know, and then when I came to the States, it was very much like the obvious disconnect of, okay, now I am truly a minority,
Right.
especially at DePauw in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, where I'm just a minority in a predominantly white school. I don't know that this answers your question, but I think for me, the thing that really has anchored me throughout my life was that connection to music. And it was using that almost as like a salve, I guess, or something to, something to anchor myself within.
Any specific kinds of music, or whichever you got your hands on?
Whatever I got my hands on. I love choral music, which I guess I might have to. I think that's a requirement to be in Cantus.
It's certainly convenient.
Yeah. I love vocal music in particular, and I love, you know, how voices interact with each other when we're singing together and with each other, and all of that stuff. And I think I would say throughout my life I have had a deeper emotional connection to music than with my, you know, particular ethnicity. And that's not denigrating, you know, how I identify. I think that's just the reality of it. For me growing up, it was like, okay, this is just a part of who I am, and I haven't really had to think about it.
Right. Yeah, and if you were white, you would probably never have to think about it.
Right. Yeah. And you know, I think now looking back, there's maybe a little bit of, not shame necessarily, but a little bit of wistfulness that, like, you know, I am not fluent in Japanese, and I don't know any of the Okinawan language. But that's not, I don't cast fault on myself or my parents, just because when my parents were growing up, they were taught English, and that was the way. My parents don't really know their respective languages either.
Yeah, and I think that I resonate a lot with that, and I think a lot of it comes down to, for me, feeling like there's Filipino and Chinese, and there's American, and somehow I am both, and feeling that meant I had to be both and, meaning I had to fully understand everything that America, whatever, and then there's this shame of like, oh, I'm not learning the language. I don't know how to cook. I don't know how to talk. All these things, but the reality that I'm starting to realize is like, no, I'm not both. I am Filipino, Chinese, American, and part of that identity is I don't speak the languages,
right?
And I know what they sound like,
yeah,
but I don't speak them,
yeah. And that's okay.
And that's okay.
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Is there anything that you feel like you have learned in the process of bringing this music to us at Good Sam?
I think it's really not rekindled, but at least it's kind of reignited a little bit of my own love for this kind of music, and for choral music in particular, for SATB choral music, and for exploring these kinds of non-Western, not old dead white guys kind of music.
For sure.
I think there's such a, even within a particularly narrow genre such as choral music, there's such a diversity and such a range of styles that need to be heard.
Yeah.
And so I've really enjoyed bringing that back and working with you all on it. It's been really fun.
It's been great. Would you tell us a little bit about these pieces that we're going to be hearing?
Sure. So the first, one of the pieces that we're doing is a Japanese piece called Sen no Kaze ni Natte, and it's a translation of the poem do not stand at my grave and weep, I am not there, I did not sleep. It's a translation of that poem by an anonymous author into Japanese. And I first came to it in my own youth chorus when we did it for, I forget which year it was, but we sang this piece, and I fell in love with it. And I've programmed it a couple of times when I was leading a couple of choirs in various capacities, and I think the message of it is really beautiful. The way that the melody is composed is really, really gripping, and I really like it a lot. One of the other pieces is a Hawaiian hymn called Nakea Kua. Excuse me. Nakea Kua is composed by John McCreary, who was the canon organist at St. Andrew's Cathedral in downtown Honolulu. And he was there for 35 years and had an amazing tenure, leading at the church and teaching at a school there. And he really kind of shepherded this he helped to foster this long-reaching kind of net of choral music lovers in Hawaii. So he's made an incredible contribution to the music there. Cool. The last piece is called Ku'upua I Paua Kalani, which was written by Hawaii's last queen, Lili'uokalani. This particular song is really important to me and for a lot of people in Hawaii. Queen Lili'uokalani wrote this when she was under house arrest. She was imprisoned in her own palace, in Iolani Palace, in Honolulu during the time of the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. And she she was kept under house arrest and kind of, was devoid of any information of how her people were and her kingdom and all of that stuff. And the only way that she was able to get information was that her handmaiden son would deliver her every day a bouquet of flowers from her own garden. First from Uluhai Malama, which was her main garden, and he would wrap them in newspaper, really, really slyly wrap them in newspaper so that then she could at least have, at least knowledge of what was going on. One of these days, he brought her flowers from another one of her gardens called Paua Kalani, which is in the title of the song. And she was so moved by this that she composed this, in her room. She was a brilliant composer, and she was a genius, really. She spoke 4 different languages, probably more, played 4 different instruments, had perfect pitch, was a choir director, and composed melodies by ear.
I've loved learning about her, and was just beloved, right? People love her.
Really beloved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was the last queen before the U.S.
Yep.
overthrew the Hawaiian. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming to Good Samaritan and sharing your gifts and your experiences and all these things with us so openly and authentically.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, we hope you enjoy the music that you're about to hear.